is Russell Hittinger. I am the William K. Warren Chair of Catholic Studies at the University of Tulsa, where I am also a research professor of law. This course on Catholic social doctrine will consist of 4 written lessons. The first lesson covers the emergence of Catholic social doctrine in the 19th century, particularly during the pontificate of Pope Leo XIII, who wrote some 110 encyclicals and other teaching letters. This was quite an accomplishment for a man who was 68 years old at the time of his election in 1878. Your second written lesson asks 2 questions. First, what does the word social add to the word doctrine? Second, why is social doctrine placed under moral theology? Then, in this second lesson, we can turn to the compendium of the social doctrine of the Church, issued in 2004 by the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. It maintains that there are 4 basic principles which run almost like a Bach feud throughout Catholic social doctrine: dignity of the individual, solidarity, subsidiarity, and common good. In Lesson 2, we will cover the first 2. Its main concern is how individual dignity includes memberships in societies. The third written lesson will take up the second 2 principles, subsidiarity and the common good. The fourth written lesson will deal with the idea of social justice. But just now, my lecture will cover some of the important points in lessons 2 and 3. Preliminary note: I should bring to your attention that the names and dates of the popes and of the Roman teaching documents, as well as a bibliography of secondary literature, are all included in the written lessons. Pope Pius XI, who was pope from 1922 until 1939, was the first pope to speak of social doctrine as a unified body of teachings which developed by way of clarity and application. In Quadragesimo Anno, 1931, Pius claimed that he had inherited a doctrine handed on from the time of Leo XIII. And by any measure, it's a prodigious tradition. Beginning in 1878 with the election of Leo, popes have issued more than 250 encyclicals and other teaching letters. About half are related broadly to issues of social thought and doctrine. Since the time of the Second Vatican Council, this new doctrinal specialty is placed under moral theology. Moral philosophy and moral theology overlap insofar as they study the right ordering of human actions to ends. All moral doctrine, therefore, is based upon the 2 great commandments: love of God and love of neighbor. Accordingly, Catholic social doctrine, under moral theology, is especially interested in the virtues of justice and charity. Perhaps the first and most obvious question is this: what does this word social add to the word moral? The short answer is that being right with God and one's neighbor includes membership in societies which themselves need to be rightly ordered both within and one to the others. And even our individual actions, which might be taken as merely self-regarding, that is, actions properly undertaken for one's own good, are nevertheless orderable to a community. As St. Thomas Aquinas said, a man's good or evil actions, although not immediately ordained to the good or evil of another, are nevertheless ordained to the good or evil of another, that is, the community, unquote. So, we can speak of being right, not only with one's neighbors as singular persons, one by one, but also being rightly ordered to and rightly ordered within communities. At least for a start, this gives us some traction in understanding how the term social is related to a doctrine that comes under moral theology. This doctrine teaches the principles of being rightly ordered to our neighbors as individuals, being rightly ordered as a member of a social whole, and the various ways societies are rightly ordered one to the other. Moreover, we have to appreciate that groups are themselves moral agents in patience. That is, they can harm and be harmed in the moral sense of the term. The doctrinal theologian, therefore, must study what the authoritative sources, Scripture, councils, teachings of the ordinary magisterium, tell us about the nature and proper actions of social entities. This, of course, encompasses a very wide array of social phenomena: churches, polities, families, economic organizations, only to mention a few of the most prominent. The project of the doctrinal theologian in issues related to the social sphere is also complex because of the historical nature of the subject matter. It's one thing to understand the principles drawn from theology and philosophy. It's quite another thing to understand concrete social realities. In his Christmas message of 1955, Pope Pius XII pointed out that although the principles of social order are natural, the social realities themselves change over time with social developments, unquote. Some changes are brought about by historical forces, which cannot be attributed directly to anyone's decision or policy. Other developments, however, arise from within societies as they themselves bring about new ways of molding and forming the order of the common good. Families, associations, markets, political constitutions, and the law of nations are all dynamic. Whereas in doctrinal theology proper, the revealed data are unfolded with more clarity and richness as the Church reflects upon the deposit of faith. We recall it took nearly 4 centuries of councils to get properly formulated the person and nature of Christ. But in social doctrine, the teachings also include applications of principles to the contingencies of societies. And these applications have to change somewhat as the facts change. Of course, they never change absolutely, but they certainly change by way of emphasis. Now, on particular issues of social doctrine, labor unions, the environment, political parties, war and peace, and a myriad of other things, you should consult the compendium of the social doctrine of the Church, which gathers together the major magisterial pronouncements under various topical headings. Along with other works included in our bibliography, it will help you to understand, for example, why the problem of Catholic vocational societies in the 19th century was somewhat different than the issue of labor unions in the early 20th century, and why, for example, issues of Catholic political parties, democracy, and the proper use of medical technology change over time. In this lecture, however, our job is to consider the underlying principles of Catholic social doctrine, the things that don't change. And once again, I want to take as our guide the compendium, which I said lists 4 basic principles: the dignity of the human person, solidarity, subsidiarity, and common good. While all 4 of these principles include the dignity of the human person, you will note that the last 3 are specifically and irreducibly social. The dignity of the human person cannot be interpreted on the premise of what some people call methodological individualism, namely, that social unities and relations among members of societies can be reduced to non-social properties of these members or just composites thereof. Let me now turn to individuality and solidarity. Margaret Thatcher famously said that there is, quote, no such thing as society. There are only individual men and women, and there are families. It was a curious remark, for she includes the family, which is a prime candidate for what we would count as a society. Probably she was complaining about some undifferentiated notion of society with a capital S, the organs of which are the welfare state. Why this, in turn, could not count as a society under the category of polity is hard to say without knowing Lady Thatcher's mind. But let's suppose that Lady Thatcher wished to make a more philosophically subtle point. For it is surely correct that groups like families, polities, clubs, teams, and colleges do not possess the unity of an individual substance. The two creation myths of Genesis clearly distinguish between the one flesh unity of Adam and Eve, the marriage of Adam and Eve, and the antecedent sequence of natural kinds. Indeed, sacred scripture seems to confirm common sense and untutored observation. Marriage does not have a nature in the same sense as a plant, a bird, or even a human being. When two or more people are constituted in a society, there is not produced a second or third natural kind. As for who are the real persons, they are individuals of a rational nature who are also members of societies that constitute something more than the sum of their parts. Thomas Aquinas notes in his treatise on justice, in the Summa Theologiae, that justice regards actions, and actions belong to supposits and totalities. That is, to individual persons of a rational nature and to groups. In sum, justice concerns individual persons, and then from a different point of view, individual persons as members of a unity of order that transcends the sum of the parts. The key is this double consideration of personal agency. We can consider the agent first and properly as an individual person, or what was called an hypostasis, or first substance. Our moral evaluations track the intentions and actions of that singular person who enjoys the unity of a substance. But from another point of view, we can consider the same agent insofar as he or she is a member of a society. And there are many Latin names for a society. Of course, societas, persona moralis, corpus mysticum, collegium, universitas, communitas. In the legal and theological world formed by Latin culture, these and other such terms are sometimes used as terms of art, especially in law. More often they're used interchangeably, simply to denote a group whose agency depends upon what is called the form of order. And here, once again, we must turn to Thomas Aquinas. A society possesses what Thomas called unity of order. Here I quote, "It must be known that the whole which a political group or the family constitutes has only unity of order, for it is not something absolutely one. A part of this whole, therefore, can have an operation that is not the operation of the whole, as a soldier in an army has an activity that does not belong to the entire army. However, this whole has an operation that is not proper to the parts, but to the whole." Pause. It's the army that wins the victory, but it's the individual soldier who scouts over the hill. This unity of order is distinguished, first, from the unity of substance, and second, from a merely juxtapositional unity. And here we quote Thomas again. "Now, one way in which one comes from many is the way of order alone. So, from many houses a city comes to be, or from many soldiers an army. Another way is that of order and composition. So a house comes to be when they join together its parts and walls. But neither of these two ways fit the constitution of one nature from a plurality. For things whose form of order or juxtaposition are not natural things, the result is that their unity cannot be called a unity of nature." Unquote. Therefore, in a unity of order, each member possesses what is individually proper to himself, namely certain operations and actions that are not reducible to the commonality and which are never dissolved or canceled by membership in a group. At the same time, a society is not a mere juxtaposition of things. It's a real unity transcending the aggregation of its members. This notion of a unity of order, which was drawn from Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas, began to be used over and over again by the social magisterium, beginning with Leo XIII. And I believe this category just brings into view certain kinds of facts available to our common sense. That individuals in a queue, waiting for a bus, are the parts, not the members of a queue, and they are members, not the mere parts of St. Rita's parish. To simply be in a line waiting for a bus, that kind of unity is merely a unity of juxtaposition or aggregation. But being members of St. Rita's parish is a unity of order. For France, the Catholic Church, the local labor union, or St. Rita's parish, change of constituents can sustain rather than destroy the identity of the group. So, wherever there are plural rational agents aiming at common ends through united action, and where their unity is one of the intrinsic goods being aimed at, we have a society, something distinct in dignity. To use once again the traditional terminology, the group is said to have an extrinsic common good, victory for the army, or peace for the city, and an intrinsic common good, that is the common good of their own action, the form, the unity of their action. Groups differ quite dramatically in terms of their respective ends and their forms of unity. A faculty, for example, aims to advance learning and to educate students, and they do it together by common deliberation. But unlike a marriage, the intrinsic unity of a college faculty does not depend upon conjugal relations. Traditionally, a matrimonial society has only one form, a man and a woman who share life unto perpetuity as a whole through a one-flesh act of sexual unity. For its part, a state or a polity can have plural forms, rule by one, rule by a few, rule by many, or some combination of those. It can consist of different proportions of men, women, and children. Clearly, societies are quite different in their respective ends and modes of unity. Here now is a key principle. Social form is an intrinsic common good which cannot be distributed or cashed out. The common good of a society never exists as a mere private good, and therefore, when someone exits a marriage or a polity, he or she cannot take away his private share. Even in our confused legal cultures today, courts understand perfectly well that they can divide and distribute the external properties, but not the marriage itself. One cannot get a divorce and take away 50, 40, 30, or even 1% of the marriage. It's simply not a divisible thing. The matrimonial society, therefore, cannot be redistributed. It can only be dissolved or annulled. Any group will hold itself out to the rest of the world as something distinct in dignity, possessing rights and responsibilities. Take, for example, the American Declaration of Independence. Quote, "We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and decree that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states." Unquote. They have simply put themselves out to the rest of the world as a social entity, not a mere juxtaposition of parts, but parts that are of a whole. They don't hold themselves out to the world as though they were one, but rather as one. And other polities will not treat this new unity, called the United States, justly if they attempt to do business only with England, or perhaps only with Rhode Island. A new social unity has come into existence by the common action of its members, and it makes a moral claim on the rest of the world to have a locus of rights and responsibilities. But what was the form? What was the common form of this new social entity? Well, 11 years after the Declaration of Independence, this was made clear in the preamble of the Constitution. I quote, "We, not me, not you, not them, we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America," unquote. And then what follows, in the Articles of the Constitution, this people adopted the form through which they would commonly pursue these common ends. Let's think back to Genesis. The 6 days of creation, the so-called hexameron, crowns creation not with another natural kind, not with another thing, much less with an aggregation of material forces in mere juxtaposition. Creation is crowned with a society of Adam and Eve. In Jewish and in Christian allegorical exegesis, this society was in turn the type of another society, Israel or the church. Indeed, it was Augustine in the Confessions who said, creation is for the sake of the church, that is, a social body. For his part, Thomas argued that God declared the unity of order on the sixth day very good because he wished, and here I quote, he wished to produce his works in likeness to himself, so far as possible, in order that they may be perfect and that he might be known through his works. Hence, that he may be portrayed in his works, not only according to what he is in himself, but also as he acts upon others. He laid this natural law upon all things, that last things should be reduced and perfected by middle things, and middle things by the first, unquote. In other words, we are made unto the image of God, not only because each individual person possesses the excellence of a rational nature, but also because we must cause good in others through ordered sets of relationships. Virtually all of the modern popes have highlighted this principle in social doctrine. In his first social encyclical against socialism, for example, Pope Leo XIII paraphrases Thomas's doctrine that God creates a social order of causes in order that these causes may imitate his own goodness. Here I quote from Pope Leo. "For he who created and governs all things has, in his wise providence, appointed that the things that are lowest should attain their ends by those which are intermediate, and these again by the highest. Thus, as even in the kingdom of heaven, he has willed that the choirs of angels be distinct, some subject to others, and also in the church has instituted various orders and a diversity of offices, so that all are not apostles or doctors or pastors. So also he has appointed that there should be various orders in civil society, differing in dignity, rights, power, whereby the state, like the church, should be one body consisting of many members, some nobler than others, but all necessary to one another and solicitous for the common good," unquote. Key point, it's from this twofold imaging of God flows the dignity of the individual and the dignity of social orders. Notice that these two imagings are without rivalry precisely because of the recurring distinctions made by the popes between a unity of substance, that is the rational nature of an individual person, and a unity of order, that is a multiplicity of rational beings constituting a true society. What rightfully belongs to the individual person is not confused, destroyed, or assimilated when he is positioned and perfected within a social order. Otherwise, society would be a suicide pact. But let us return for a moment to a more mundane plane from which to survey the nature of a society. In his seminal essay on moral personality and legal personality, the British legal historian F.W. Maitland writes, here I quote, "When a body of 20 or 2,000 or 200,000 men bind themselves together to act in a particular way for some common purpose, they create a body which by no fiction of law, but by the very nature of things, differs from the individuals of whom it is constituted. If the law allows men to form permanently organized groups, these groups will be, for common opinion, right and duty-bearing units. And if the lawgiver will not openly treat them as such, he will misrepresent, or as the French say, he will denature the facts. For the morality of common sense, a group is a person. It is a right and duty-bearing unity," unquote. And therefore, when individuals with a note of permanence engage in united action for a common purpose, there comes into existence a unity that transcends the sum of its parts. That is to say, there comes into existence a group person, a society, that requires the rest of us to treat it not only as a set of individuals, but as Maitland put it, an N+1 person. N for the number of individual persons who are members, and one person that's more than the sum of the members, that is the group itself. Of course, every society depends upon its individual persons. This is just what Aristotle and Thomas meant by a unity of order, inasmuch as the members are not reducible to the whole, as though they were accidents being reduced to an underlying substance. Groups are not ontologically basic in the order of substance. They are basic, however, in constituting a unity that excels the parts, the members who are themselves also wholes as natural persons. So what Maitland calls an N+1 unity means the group or society, and not just the individual members, should morally count. As the bearer of rights and responsibilities, a society can harm or be harmed in the moral sense of the term. We harm a society when we fail to recognize its common good and its agency as an N+1 person by refusing to give it its proper legal status. In such cases, we do something more than just harm the individuals or what privately belongs to the individuals. More precisely, we harm what those individuals as members hold in common. It's precisely in this context that we should interpret John Paul II's use of the term subjectivity of society, which is used in the encyclical Centesimus Annus. Quote, "The social nature of man is not completely fulfilled in the state, but is realized in various intermediary groups, beginning with the family and including economic, social, political, and cultural groups, which stem from human nature itself and which have their own autonomy. This is what I have called subjectivity of society, which together with the subjectivity of the individual was canceled by real socialism," unquote. Now, as we can gather from the Pope's remarks here, a society is something more than intersubjectivity. It's an intersubjectivity that constitutes a subject in its own right. This distinction between intersubjectivity and an intersubjectivity that becomes a subject in its own right is also drawn from ordinary experience. A number of individuals in a shopping mall certainly evince intersubjectivity without pretending to constitute a society. Regarding this kind of phenomenon, the philosopher Thomas Hobbes speaks of a mere concourse of wills without any intention to constitute a union. We have a concourse of individual wills and in intersubjectivity, more or less spontaneously converging on similar objects. We see this every day in the marketplace of a city, or at a sports event, or at a theater, or the opera. And this kind of intersubjectivity is not harmed. Rather, it is quite likely facilitated when we refuse it the status of a society or a group. So, here's another key principle. There are many kinds of intersubjectivity which have a social aspect but are not necessarily societies. As I said, audiences at sports events or operas, shoppers at the mall, even 2 or 3 men lifting together a rock out of the middle of the street. All of these manifest intersubjectivity and therefore have some social aspect. But there's no note of union or a permanence of common action or even no esteem for the common order as a good in itself. In making things common, societies, therefore, are to be distinguished not only from spontaneous modes of intersubjectivity, but also from a more specific agreement of wills that's typical of what I'm going to call a partnership. In a partnership, 2 or more people deliberately and explicitly make a contract with respect to mutually agreeable ends, while at the same time laying claim to their private shares and yields. In a mere partnership, the work is traceable to the individual partners, but not to the partnership itself. Let's suppose I supply Honda Motors with automobile parts. I don't necessarily intend to constitute a society with Honda Motors. No corporate personality is aimed at. I do not send Christmas cards to American Honda, and American Honda does not send Christmas cards. Rather, it sends bills to me. The reciprocity between myself and Honda Motors has no aspects of permanence. It has no united action. And indeed, it requires no society whatsoever except incidentally, perhaps in breach of contract, in which case the partners have to repair to the courts of the political society. As the great Catholic philosopher Yves Simon once observed, mere partnership does not do anything to put an end to the solitude of the partners. Given my earlier example, it's sufficient that I deliver the parts, that Honda assemble the cars, and that various individuals write monthly checks for leasing the equipment. Therefore, a partnership corresponds more or less to what used to be called an universitas rerum, an organization of things. The word universitas means a variety turning toward one. And an universitas rerum is things being turned toward one, an organization of things. Each partner contributes and is entitled to yield for his private benefit precisely the parts that belong to him. Now, to be sure, there can be no organization of partnership without real persons doing their part. The essential point is it is not the persons, but rather the things that are being collected. Indeed, Pope Pius XII said, it would be wrong to think, quote, that every particular enterprise is a genuine society of persons, unquote. Now, what we're comparing and contrasting now is just different kinds of intersubjectivity. We just want to draw distinctions. This notion of intersubjectivity contains, in potentia, potentially, spontaneous intersubjectivity, spontaneous in the sense that it's not being planned. 2, deliberate relations of commutation, exchange, and partnership. And 3, collective intersubjectivities which have the property of being a subject. The Catholic tradition of social doctrine regards all of them as expressions of man's social nature. It must be emphasized that partnerships really do possess a social aspect. They require some common convergence of interests with respect to an end, even if that end terminates in private yields. Moreover, a partnership, somewhat like a society, can establish common utilities or a common pool of resources to be distributed back to the partners. While the pool is destined to division into private shares, the structure of it is not merely private. The mutual fund, for example, has the being of a partnership because it's chiefly about universitas rerum, an organization of things. But its common fund is something like a common utility. Now, in the order of justice, we harm a partnership when we prevent the partners from contributing to and extracting from what is properly theirs. It depends principally upon what's been called commutative justice. In a society, on the other hand, what the canonists always called an universitas personarum, the individuals are not parts or partners so much as members who enjoy a common order in the manner of usufructuaries. That is, each is entitled to enjoy and use what is common, but not as his or her private part. In contrast to an organization of things, such as a common pool, a common good is an order or form of common action. And as I said before, a common good is not opposed to the individual, but rather to the merely private good. For its part, partnership is not opposed to a private good. Indeed, the whole point of organizing private goods, of pooling resources, is to enhance the private yield that each of us gets. There's nothing inherently suspect about partnerships. In fact, they're probably as old as society itself, but they should never be confused with a society having a true common good. Socialism often shows a confusion between social union and association of partners. The socialist will tend to say this: an economic corporation has something less than an indivisible common good. Indeed, the socialist might suspect that this is actually a false partnership, and therefore the socialist will urge that partnerships be assimilated to true societies. The liberal individualist, on the other hand, might deem societies as confused partnerships. Right? The individualist might hold that social unions are just fictions. They really should be reduced back to alliances or partnerships between individuals. Either way, the multifaceted nature of human sociability is being contracted and compressed either into real social subjects or into mere aggregations, which, however cooperative, lack social union. Such compressions must eventually run up against what we see every day. Namely, every day we witness a diverse spectrum of human intersubjectivity. We must allow all of them to exist: spontaneous subjectivities, partnerships, true societies. Again, let us take that cue. There is a line of several people in front of a credit union. The individuals are part of the queue, they're partners in the credit union, and they are members of St. Rita's Parish. It's only the latter that deserves the word society as in something more than a metaphysical sense, in something more than a metaphorical sense, excuse me. A society, as opposed to partners or just people in a juxtapositional relationship in a line, does not just aim at a common objective, it wants it brought about by united action. Think, for example, of a family, a faculty, a crew team, or an orchestra. In each case, the reason for action includes the good of their common action. The achievement of a mutually agreeable result is not enough. To be sure, an orchestra aims to produce the music, just as the crew team aims to win the race. And for their part, married spouses aim to raise children and to send them into the wider world of societies. Yet for each of these groups, their respective corporate unity is one of the reasons for actions. An orchestra doesn't just produce the music, it produces it together. A crew team doesn't win or lose the race, it does it together. And therefore, in the case of society, unity is an intransitive good. Ordinarily, it survives the failure of the crew team to win the race. The crew team remains a crew team, even if it loses the race, but it will certainly fail to be a crew team if it doesn't do it together. This is why marriages can survive the failure to produce children. Or a state can survive its failure to negotiate the treaty with another state. All true societies having an internal social union can survive having their common end thwarted, but they will never survive overlooking their internal mode of unity. On the other hand, partnerships usually do not survive the failure of partners to secure the mutually agreeable ends for which the arrangement was constructed. In sum, we will find human sociability manifesting itself in a variety of ways: spontaneous intersubjectivities, deliberate partnerships, and authentic societies. But the order of a society is something more perfect, for it not only has greater unity and durability, but most importantly, it has a common good that's intrinsically valuable to each of its members. And it's in this context we can recall Cardinal Cajetan's famous dictum, mihi sed non propter me, for me, but not for my sake. Every member of a society, whether it's a crew team, or a marriage, or a faculty, or a church, or a polity, can always say, mihi sed non propter me, for me, but not for my sake. So there are three ways to destroy a society. First, by destroying its members. Second, by disintegration of the aim to achieve common ends through united action. Third, by destroying the instrument of authority that coordinates the common action. So let me summarize where we are at this point. Societies are unities of order which cannot be reduced either to substantial unity nor to a unity of mere juxtaposition or aggregation. Societies are constituted not only according to having common ends, but also by a shared structure or an intrinsic common good. The word common is opposed to private, but it's not opposed to individual. Each member in a society shares the common good of order. But what is common cannot be cashed out or taken as a private share. One who leaves a club, a marriage, a church, or a polity cannot require the common good to be distributed to him or her. And this is precisely what marks the difference between a society and a partnership. For a social unity of order, the parts are also wholes, individual persons, which retain their own proper operations. Social order does not happen merely by a spontaneous instinctual properties of the species. When I get out of bed in the morning, I have to make no choice about the matter. I am still substantially a human being. But if I am to be a member of the society, I do have to make some choice about the matter. That is, I have to act in common with other members of the society. Now, Catholic social doctrine often repeats St. Thomas's famous dictum, quote, "Man is not ordained to the body politic according to all that he is and has," unquote. But this principle holds true of any society. Whatever the dignity of a society, it does not supplant, but rather presupposes the dignity of the individual person. The individual person's intentional act of judgment and knowledge is not reducible to society as an effect to a cause. At the same time, knowledge is eminently shareable and made common. For St. Thomas, society is not a thing, it's a communication. Precisely because every society consists of a diversity of members who retain their own proper operations, human persons can be members of plural societies. A key point. Every human being can be a member of more than one society. Husband and wife are members of a municipality, of a nation, of a church. Their children are members of the family, or members of the college or a team. Each of these memberships can be referred in turn to a wider society at both the level of the state and the international order. Human sociability is not exhausted in a single membership. And as you will learn in the fourth written lesson, the chief goal of social justice is the harmonizations of all of these different societies. So let me summarize this part of the lecture with a quotation from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Quote, "A society is a group of persons bound together organically by a principle of unity that goes beyond each one of them. As an assembly that is at once visible and spiritual, a society endures over time. It gathers up the past and prepares for the future. By means of society, each man is established as an heir and receives certain talents that enrich his own identity and whose fruits he must develop. He rightly owes loyalty to the communities of which he is a part and respect those in authority who have charge of the common good." Unquote.